Hi Rachel, I'm very happy to have you here, and I was really looking forward to this interview with you. So I recently met you, and I was so happy and so excited about what you were doing. So before we start this time, let's get to know you a little bit.
So I'm a teacher, and I've been a teacher for 15 years. I've been 9 years with the Toronto District School Board here in Toronto. I'm also a speaker, so I speak about how to create emotionally safe and empowering spaces in the classroom and beyond. So essentially it's anti-bullying work, but it's beyond anti-bullying work where I see the classroom as a community, as a potential for the world, so that I look for the best in every single child, and then we become a community, regardless of our background, our race, our religion, our diversities, and we rise up to be change makers, essentially.
Tell us about the Canadian education system. How would you describe it to someone that has no idea?
Interesting. Well, as I had lived overseas for 5 years, so I've seen bits and pieces of different education systems, and I lived in Japan for 2.5 years. So the system that I saw in Japan is very different than Canada, and when Japanese students come here, I think they're surprised. So it's from Japan to here, it's more relaxed. They have more space. They don't have as many standardized tests. They finish school at like 3:30. They go home. They maybe study, maybe don't. So I would say we've got a mix of, they have some activism in the schools. So kids are doing things around environment, things around character education, being a good person. And then we have the regular standard math, science, geography, language arts, things like that. So I've been working as a supply teacher for many years, so I am kind of jumping into like the day and just seeing what's happening for the day in all the different grades from kindergarten to grade 8. Yeah, so I would say, I mean, we have 3 recesses. Kids get to play. We have gym, we have music. Sadly, we do not have a lot of art unless the teacher is teaching it. I haven't seen hardly, art has kind of been eliminated in terms of an actual teacher. Yeah.
You mentioned supply teacher. What exactly is that?
Yeah, so for our American friends or maybe some other countries, substitute teacher, that's the translation. To me, I think, like, my mentality about it is those are my kids for the day. Like, I don't just think, oh, these are just like random kids, who cares? Like, I really deeply care about them. And then I'm usually back. So I'm kind of, I see myself as a fairy godmother. And I mean, I'm in their lives over the time period of many years. It's interesting because when I lived in Japan, I taught, my schedule would be 3-year-olds, and then I would teach businessmen, and then I would teach teenagers. This is all in a day, like an hour would switch, then I teach housewives. And what I found is I actually didn't have one favorite age. I actually worked well with all of them, and I always used to say that my adults cried a little bit less than my 3-year-olds, but they still cried. So, yeah.
So tell us about all this process about becoming a teacher.
Yeah.
I believe it's very different from many countries that teaching all the subjects and all the different grades.
Right. So elementary school here, when I trained for 1 year. They've just changed it to a 2-year program. So I have a Bachelor of Education. It is, you train about all the different subjects. So you have like a bit of math, you learn about a bit of whatever, and then when you are placed in your contract position or your long-term occasional, so if a teacher leaves, you become the teacher for like a month or 2 months or a year, depending on the time. Then you dive into what would it be like to be a grade 3 teacher, and you look at all the curriculum and make it towards that. But when we're training, we get like kind of like bits and pieces of all the different subject matter.
Okay, a little personal question here. What is your favorite subject to talk about and teach?
Oh gosh.
What do you like talking about a lot?
Yeah, well, I am talking about being the best human being you can be. I am often talking about compassion and kindness. So anything I do, when you ask me what I teach, I will teach the math, I will teach the science. These are not my favorite things to teach, but what is underneath that is all about how you can be a best human being that you can be. So I'm always weaving in, like, if somebody, like, you know, couldn't get the math right or gives up, it's all about mindset. Like, you can try harder, you can help the person that doesn't know. It's social dynamics that I'm teaching about.
Nice.
Yeah.
Tell us about your personal path that kind of led it to that
Oh, right.
direction.
That's yeah. It's well, it's not. It hasn't been an easy one. I had a really hard time in school. So I number one have a learning disability. So I don't like that terminology because I learn differently. And on a spiritual level, I always say my soul didn't come here to do math. It's not here to do math. It's here to do art and creative things and work with children. I can do math, but it is hard for my brain. So school was not easy in that way. I was also bullied the whole way through. So from kindergarten to high school, I had a lot of trauma with groups of people that just weren't very unkind. So I grew up feeling like, why don't the adults know what they're doing? Why isn't it safe in school? And I'm going to change that when I grow up. So I'm 100% and beyond committed to this journey.
So you decided to become a teacher when
Yeah.
you were actually quite young.
Yeah, I was 5 years old.
That's
I was
amazing.
practicing being a teacher at 5 years. I lined up all my stuffed animals, and I was very bossy at that time. And I would say, Big Teddy, you're in the corner. Little Ducky, you have to read. Yeah, so I had a whole system. I made my own report cards and yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about becoming a teacher process. So
Sure.
how does the education go? So your plan was since you were 5-year-old, and then how did you map out your education and then?
Well, at 6 years old, no, I'm just kidding. Kindergarten was totally focused on becoming a teacher. So I studied visual arts, and I looked into. I always knew I wanted to be a teacher. I always knew I wanted to be an artist. But I looked into what the process was, and so at the time, a long time ago, like early 2000s, the easiest route was to whatever you want to study, like a 4-year degree. So I studied visual arts for 4 years, and then from there you did an additional Bachelor of Education, and you added on to it. So altogether your degree was like 5 years, but you had 2 degrees. You could also do concurrent, which means like together. So you could study together the whole way through. Like you could study geography, but at the same time you're studying to become a teacher. So I just did 2 different ones. Now, I'm pretty sure that you do, I haven't checked in with this, but I'm pretty sure you do a 4-year degree, and then you add on the 2 years. Yeah, if you want to become a teacher now.
And then?
And then you're done.
Then I can just find a job as a teacher anyway?
Well, okay, it has not
Let's
been
talk
easy the
about that.
last many years. So I got into the system, so I've been a teacher for 9 years, and so I studied 10 years ago to become a teacher. And so at the time, it was a really difficult time to become a teacher. And a lot of people told me, like, don't even try, it's too difficult, because they weren't opening up the school boards to apply. So if you had French, or if you were a male applying in elementary school, because they don't have as many men, they wanted representation, or different diverse backgrounds of like different people from different backgrounds in different countries. So they wanted that, but I didn't really fit into it, so it was harder for me to get in. It took another year, I think. Now it's much easier. They're much more open to having people come in because there's more space, there's more teachers that we need. And in the time when I got in, you could just like go right into the classroom and start teaching basically. Now you have to do a certain amount of supply teaching, and then you have to apply to become a contract teacher or an LTO teacher.
If this person had an education or teaching experience in another country, is that kind of transferable?
This is a good question. I'm not sure. I think you definitely would have to do something, and province to province you can transfer, but I'm pretty sure if you came, let's say from Turkey or from another country, you couldn't just go into the system. Yeah, you'd have to do, I don't know if you'd have to redo everything. I have met people along the way, and I think you might need to do the whole degree again. So I remember meeting somebody years ago, and she was a teacher in her own country. She also studied to be an engineer. She couldn't even get into the system, so she had to go back and like wait and volunteer. So it's not easy.
So you have been working with teachers that's coming from different backgrounds.
Yeah.
Just like your students.
Yeah.
So how do you find working with them, or like if you were to look at this whole system from their perspective, what do they really like about it? What are some of the challenges they find?
So for example, my really good friend in Japan, she said that our class size is much lower than what she has in Japan. Like she had, I think she said she had 40 elementary school students, which is like blows my mind. And it's one teacher. So to that, we're doing a lot better. But the challenge would be, I mean, one thing, if you're coming from a different country, and let's say you're coming from Japan, everybody's Japanese, but if you come here, you have language issues, you have different religious ideas, you have a lot of diversity that you're not dealing with necessarily there. So that would be a challenge. Culturally, right? Like, so in Japan, there's a big culture of respect. So the teacher comes in and you bow, and it's like, you know, it's very different here. You're like, please sit down, and they're like, whatever, miss. Sometimes kids call me dude. They'll be like, dude, because they feel really comfortable. I'm like, I'm not your dude, and I'm not your bro. So, you know, I think because I have a very open approach to teaching that they feel like that. But so that kind of.
Your students are cool.
Yeah, they are cool. They are cool. And I try and stay up on the language. Like, I'll ask them, like, you know, if I hear a new term, like LOL or whatever, their YOLO or whatever, I try and stay cool and, like, know their music and things like that. Yeah.
What kind of music they're into these days?
Well, I listen, you know, when I drive, I love spoken word. So I listen to spoken word, usually on CDs, but I also I love folk music as well, but I love the radio. So I know all the like hip hop and rap and like top like pop songs. So I sing with them. Like I'll go in and we'll have like these like dance offs and like singing.
What do they usually listen? They do some spit some rap?
So the other day I was like walking around, I was teaching, it was grade 5-6 class, and I was like, okay, everyone focus on their math and really trying to get them to like get this lesson done. And this little kid's like, I want it that way. And I like go into the song and I'm like, tell me why ain't nothing. And I was like, how do you know Backstreet Boys? So sometimes they know like old school like 90s stuff that I know. So that Spice Girls, that's another thing. I'm like, yes, I can sing with you.
Are you guys best friends now?
Yeah, we're besties.
Great. Actually, like majority of my one of the core ideas of my videos are the diversity in different environments. So how does that come into play in a lovely classroom? Let's talk about that a little bit.
Okay, so diversity. The first thing that's coming to mind, and this is something that I really think we need to do more for. So I speak a couple of languages, not perfectly, but I do have like even just one word. We had Korean students coming from North Korea, so they were refugees. I don't know exactly how they ended up here, but then they were in our school system. We had a whole school with like a lot of North Korean students. And I know a couple words in Korean, and that, as soon as I spoke those words, immediately created connection between me and these kids. Then we were best friends. Then we were like doing all these like playful things. So it's really important that adults, like teachers, have a couple words, even just a couple words for students in their classroom. So I bring this up because we have Syrian students, and there's so much trauma that they're coming over with, and many of them don't have any English, so they only speak Arabic. Then they're put in the system, then they're coming from war-torn country, and then we're just like forcing them to sit in this environment. So I had some really heartbreaking days where I had a kindergarten student they warned me. They said, this child has only been here for one other day, yesterday. They're probably gonna scream and cry. It's a really actually emotional story. So I was with another teacher, unfortunately, that was not the regular teacher. So there's two teachers in kindergarten. One is the classroom teacher, and the other one's a classroom teacher, but they're an ECE teacher. So they're we're always partnered if it's a large group. She also was new, and I was new. So they warned me, this child's coming, and they're probably gonna have a hard time with drop-off when the parents leave. But it wasn't a regular like crying and then I can distract them and we're playing and it was fun. It was hours of them shrieking and crying and running at the door and trying to break the glass, and like it was so intense. And I have a background in understanding some like mental health stuff and therapeutic stuff. So it was so hard for me. And then I had the whole class as well. So eventually I turned to this teacher because they just kept trying to, I felt so terrible about blocking this door and just thinking about what they've been through, and I'm being seen as this like prison guard and this, you know, or something like, you know, like a really terrible person for them. So finally I just said, I'm going to open the door. This child needs to take a walk. And even though it was like not part of the rules, as soon as I opened the door, the kid completely calmed down, held my hand and pulled me. And I was like, where are we going? And they went all the way upstairs, and right in front, it was their sister's classroom. They just needed to be with somebody safe, and it was their sister. So like my eyes well up, I was almost crying. And I said to the teacher of the sister, who had a little bit more English, can she come down in our classroom and just play with this child in the sandbox and just, you know. So they went, and this child was fine after. So just thinking about, so then I started asking questions. What do we do besides ESL? What are we doing with these kids that are coming like with severe trauma? There wasn't really an answer that I got. I haven't received an answer yet. It was more like we just help them with English and we try and be kind to them. So I, on my own, would go at recess time and I would say, thinking like the loss of culture and of language and all the things that they've been torn apart from everything. So I would try and empower them, and I'd say, you're my Arabic teacher. Teach me some Arabic. So then I have all these kids from Syria giggling, and they're like, teacher, and they were like teaching me Arabic. And one of the teachers said, oh, you're so amazing. And I said, I'm just saying, you be my teacher, you teach me to empower them.
On an overall basis, when you have your students from all these different backgrounds, maybe they are newcomers or maybe they are the second generation immigrants, how do you find your personal aspects to connect those kids from different backgrounds? Do you find it challenging?
So I am so big about play and creativity. So I actually say that the language of children is play and creativity. So I've been to countries where I don't speak any of the language, and if you just start making silly faces and laughing and kicking a soccer ball, that's an international language, right? So kids, that is their language. And so the more that we can tap into our inner child as adults, the more those kids are going to feel comfortable, the better they're going to feel to actually learn the language and kind of be comfortable, because it's vulnerable to not be able, if you speak fully fluently and then you're dropped into a place where you can't even say, I need to go to the bathroom, or I need to get a drink of water, or I'm scared or lonely, it's really scary. So whenever I'm teaching a class, I'm always looking at all the different parts. So if I have a child from Syria, and like that particular example, and that child is running out, I will say, because everybody's feeling that, I will say, we know this child is having a hard time. How can we be kinder to them? How can we, like, you know, maybe they can be our Arabic teacher and empower them, or maybe they can like share about what kind of food they're eating. Or so I'm always trying to think about how we can like make it so it's a family. Right? Make it so it's a real community and everybody feels good. So whatever it is, so like different backgrounds, different religions, just everybody feels good to be the best person they can be, and we're all together. And it's not perfect, because then you'll be all together, everything will be going great and they'll be so wonderful, and then someone will be like terrible. And you're like, okay, and then you have to address that again. And sometimes I talk about it as a class, like this wasn't the best way to handle that. And then we move on, and then we get stronger, you know?
Yeah, I understand. What about the children's perspective? How do they see all this diversity and having friends from all different countries, different backgrounds, different culture?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I'm thinking like, it depends. I think sometimes it's very welcoming. If the adults are really fostering that inclusiveness and supporting that, then it's very welcoming. I think naturally, like if you're coming from a country and you have another person that speaks your language and understands your culture, you want to be with them. Yeah. But I think that I see a lot of kids like being friends together, and it's all different backgrounds and groups of people. Children, you know, are very open until we teach them not to be, you know?
Yeah, of course, I understand.
Yeah.
Let's think of a child that has coming from a house to the school every day, from some strong cultural and religious beliefs. Do you see that kid having issue transitioning a little bit harder than the others?
So when you're talking about this question, I'm thinking about some of my Muslim girls that have to wear hijab, so I know them before they wear the hijab, and then they start having to wear the hijab, and they talk about what they're afraid about, that they're going to feel hot in the summer. We don't have air conditioning in the schools. Trust me, that's a sauna.
I'm surprised.
Yes, I am too. I don't know how a government. Yeah. Anyways, we do not have air conditioning, so there's heat stroke. Like, it's definitely been unbearable at certain points.
Really?
Yeah, yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah, so there's been some protests about it the last couple of years. So, yeah, so they're in a hijab, or even just like friend-wise or feeling different, right? So that's like one thing I'm thinking about. Another thing is values, like religious values, right? So I remember I was teaching a class, and it was a bunch of different, it was an ESL class, so it was a bunch of different backgrounds. And one of the little kids said, if you don't believe in Jesus, then you're going to hell. And so, like, I'm Jewish, there was a Muslim child, there was an atheist child. So I said, but you're friends with everybody. So this means that, do you think that this person's not a good person? So it's very, I always try to be very careful in that situation, but it's also, I want to speak the values of, like, inclusiveness and celebrating diversity. So I never want somebody to feel judged or bad. And so if that's the kind of messaging that's coming from home, I will somewhat challenge it in a way that's, like, supportive. Yeah, I think, and then the other thing is the LGBTQ plus being inclusive. So somebody, I think, I know that if religion is against any humanity, then they've lost the plot of humanity for their religious beliefs. So if we are saying, that's truly my belief, is I'm not against religion, I'm against humankind's interpretation where it's against any group of people.
I agree.
So that part I have an issue with, of, like, you know, when we're trying to teach the sex ed curriculum, and kids are pulled because we're talking about inclusiveness about LGBTQ plus children, that's an issue as well. Yeah, but overall, I think, like, the challenges for the children is the divide, right? Like, if parents are telling them anything, if parents tell you that Santa Claus is real, sorry, listeners, but if parents tell you Santa Claus is real, that's, like, on a cuter level, but it is actually really upsetting. I've had kids almost have, like, fighting, like punching each other over if Santa Claus is real or not, because one child learned at their home it's not, and one child still believes. So that's on a lower level of the struggle that they go through, right?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Actually, I want to go back to that LGBTQ issue, because I personally it's very important to me as well. And then I think we have still some room to improvement, actually a lot, but just compared to another countries, I'm really proud of the Canada's place for that.
Yeah.
How do you think this whole issue is addressed in the school environment between the for the students, especially for the teachers?
We talk about representation, right? So for races, like, we want, I think the correct terminology is racialized teachers. So not just white teachers. We want to see diversity in the teaching population. We don't talk about this in terms of gender or sexuality. So I met somebody who is transitioned. They were actually female to male, and they transitioned while they were at the same school, and it was so unsafe for them. Like, people were, like, trying to break into the room and, like, you know, vandalize things and you know, fight them. Like, it was that they had to switch schools. So I still feel like, even though teachers might identify as a different gender or different sexuality, it's on paper it's safe, but it's not. Many people are not out because of fear of, like, they have religious communities in the school population, or, you know, what's that inclusion. So we do have some out and some not out. There is still homophobic language being thrown around in the schools with bullying. I have a really good friend of mine who runs an incredible organization called Get Real, and he actually was a bully and was homophobic and would bully people about being gay. And when he grew up, he had a gay friend, and then he changed his way of thinking and created an entire organization. He's straight, and he goes in and educates people about how not to use that language and how we can be a better human being. So he's creating huge change, and some of those schools have brought him in. But for example, I had one student who, again, this is just somebody I met that day, but because I'm very open, kids trust me. And she said, I'm really afraid because I think that I might be gay, and my mother is from this particular cultural background and has told me I'm going to hell, and like if I ever said something like that. And she was crying when she was telling me. And her teacher was gay, but he wasn't openly gay. So then it was this whole thing of like, oh my gosh, we have the opportunity to be a role model, but it's still hard for us as adults because it's still not totally safe. And then she's suffering. So at that end of the day, the next day I was at another school, and I knew them very, very well. And they were very open school, and they had a lot of, conversations about these kinds of things. They were older, they were in grade 6. And I said to them, there was a poster. We have, at every school they have posters, don't bully anybody, and this is a safe space. And it's like a triangle, I think, with a rainbow. So it's supposed to be for kids. But when I asked them, what does that mean? Like, where do you go? All of them said, we don't know. So imagine like you're struggling with your sexuality or your gender. You see a poster, you're like, oh, thank God, somebody understands me. But then you have nowhere to go. You don't have a teacher that you know that you can go to. You don't have a principal. So it's just kind of a poster. So it doesn't do, it's a start, but it doesn't do as much as what we really need. So there are kids that are identifying more and more as they are transgender. They want to have pronouns being used as they. So I'm always respectful. I always encourage, sometimes actually the kids really like changing their names. They're like, my name's Michelle, but I'm going by Tammy today. I'm like, oh my God, because then all of them start changing their names, and I've just met all of them. So that's a bit hard for me, but I always try. I always try to respect them, and especially if it's a pronoun. And I call other kids in about not, like if one child doesn't remember, oh, that person wants to be called he instead of she, or they instead of she or he, or Z or whatever, it's all about respecting what they want.
From your experience so far, are kids, to what extent do the kids are aware of this issue? Or?
I think it depends. So for example, the alternative school that I was teaching at, it was incredible. One child came up to me in the morning and said, I really want to talk to you. And they're young, they're in grade 1, and said, I want to be called they, and I want a new name, or he. No, it was he, and I want to be called this name, a new name. And so we had community meetings where the whole school comes together. And so this child asked me, I don't feel comfortable, can you share with the community my new pronoun and my name? So they sat with me and we shared it, and everybody just called them that name. So because this school has community meetings and they share their feelings about everything, whatever, it was just accepted right away. Mm-hmm. So I think that if the culture is of acceptance and compassion and talking about these things, it's an easy thing to accept. If we're not used to that, then it's harder.
So the culture and the general rules of the school is very different from the neighborhood that is, or the name that is, or I believe all the elementary schools in Canada are public schools.
Yeah,
right?
Well, we have private schools as well. There's a Catholic board, which is actually publicly funded. And I always found that weird because I'm Jewish and we had to pay for school or any other kind of like religious or private school. But Catholic school is funded. So that's kind of an interesting...
Some of them are a little bit more equal.
It's showing who has power, right? And maybe that will shift in the future. I'm not against having religious schools, but I think that there's a lot to be said, and what I really believe is we need way more of bringing in First Nations culture into our schools, because we're on stolen land and we're on land that genocide has happened on. So the more we can integrate elders and teachings and really beautiful teachings of this land, the more healthy we're going to raise our children up and our society is. But the standard is that, we have a no bullying, we have character education, that's for all the schools. But schools vary in terms of like kind of the style of how they have a culture. So some schools you go in and I feel like very relaxed and very good. Some schools I feel like, oh, this doesn't feel as like warm and welcoming. You can feel it in the office right away. We've had a lot of challenges with the last couple of years with kind of changes that, the government wants to impose, and teachers are fighting that. Ultimately, I would say all teachers want to have more resources in the classroom, meaning like if we have a child coming in and they have severe behavioral issues, we need extra people in the class to support that child, because we're one person and then we have ESL kids and then it's too much. So I heard in other provinces, some provinces, they take one child, they look at their needs and they put weight to it, meaning like this child equals like what 3 children's needs would be, so we have less children in the classroom. So right now, I don't remember the exact number, but I know in kindergarten, like we can have up to 30 something kids, but you have to have 2 adults in the class, like you have the ECE and then the teacher. In other classrooms, like it could be different, but then if you have one child with severe behavioral issues, that child they take up the space and energy and emotion and time of like 10 children. They really can.
That's a serious issue, yeah.
But we still just count them as one body. So in other provinces, I've heard that they do it a little bit differently. So that's one thing. Support with autism, right? Like support with all that stuff. We have one social worker for 8 schools. You could spend your entire career in one class and still never be done kind of counseling and supporting one class.
Wow, one worker for 8 schools.
8 schools, and depending on the size of the school and whatever. So, I mean, it might be different, but that's what I've been told by the social workers. So so they don't even have a chance to have like so many of the conversations that they need to have with students that might be suicidal, might have, all sorts of challenges, mental health stuff, dealing with like, even just talking about death. Like, I read a book about, the other day about it was an older friend of this little child that died, and my student was on the floor crying, and I said, what happened? And she said, because it was an emotional book, she said, my grandmother is dying right now. So like all those conversations and stuff, we need more support with that as well.
What would you recommend to an hypothetical person? I believe there are thousands of people out there fitting this description, who is a teacher at the moment and planning to come to Canada to continue their profession, or who is about to graduate to become a teacher. What would be your recommendations? I think they would really appreciate that from a very cool teacher like yourself.
Oh, thank you. You have to love working with kids. You are not allowed to be a teacher in my heart unless you love working with kids. And you need a lot of patience, you need a lot of humor, you need a lot of play, but you also need to work on your own stuff. And so that's something that's really important for me, like reflecting back to why am I getting impatient, apologizing to kids. If I'm wrong, if I'm misunderstood, like showing that I am so sorry, even though I'm a teacher and I'm in a position of power, I made a mistake, can you forgive me? Being compassionate, like, you have to be compassionate, understanding the emotional needs of kids. So, a child that is so aggressive that can sit on the carpet and just be there for like 5 minutes of story is a big deal, right? So thinking outside the box, being open to, one of the biggest things I do is I care about my students. Like right off the bat, I'll be like, oh, I like your new hair. Your new hair is so cute. Or I'll be like, show me your new nail polish. Like even things that I'm like, maybe I wouldn't always notice, I try to really notice with them, especially the kids that are more challenged behaviorally, because then you connect with them and you can reach them when they're really triggered and they're like in a violent state, you can de-escalate them. So yeah, just being playful, being compassionate, really thinking about your classroom as a family and a community and the potential that the world has. So that those 4 walls contain all different backgrounds, all different races, diversity, neurological, diversity, neurodiversity, learning disability, everything. Like you have a mini tiny world that can be beautiful and peaceful and empowering. And then that can grow up and that can make change in a larger world.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Speaking of your speaking career, let's talk a little bit about that. What are you very passionate about speaking, and I seen you on the stage a couple times actually.
Yeah. What I speak about, like I said, is creating emotionally safe and empowering spaces in the classroom and beyond. So, meaning I want this to be a wonderful experience for kids, like the adults in their lives. So that's my main focus with speaking. And as a little girl, besides being a teacher, I dreamed of being a singer. I dreamed of being on stage with a microphone. I thought it was to be a singer, and when I realized I'm not that great at singing, although I love it, and I do want to study it at some point, I gave up that dream until I started speaking at conferences, and then I was like, oh my God, this is my dream, and it combines all my knowledge of teaching. So all of the work that I do is all interconnected. So the teaching that I do informs the speaking that I do. And I share the kind of stories that we're talking about today, how those things work with the kids that I work with, and how to do that as an adult.
That's so nice. And what are some of your other interests? Coming home from work at about 3:30 is quite nice actually. It gives you plenty of time. How do you feel the rest of your time?
I feel tired after the day because I've given so much energy. So it's a lot of recovery, in all honesty, because the way that I teach is I'm teaching from such an emotionally heart-based teaching perspective that it's like kids will tell me things that are really heavy, and my friend who is a social worker, he's like, wow, your day somewhat sounds like mine sometimes. You have to hear about really difficult things and kind of be part of that experience. But a lot of it is about recovery, and so my idea is when I go home, I want to just replenish my energy, self-care, just so that I go back and I give everything back to them. That's my whole idea. But when I go home also, I'm also working on my speaking career. So I kind of have 2 jobs, and it doesn't end, usually it ends way late at night.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
A lot later than originally planned usually. Yeah, excellent. Would you have any message for the Minister of Education?
Yeah, I would say that we really need to care on the foundation of teaching has to be emotionally based and socially emotionally aware teaching, and that all teachers need conflict resolution training. All teachers need to be called in if they're not being kind and compassionate to their students on the daily kind of not in terms of losing their patience, but a daily practice. That kids should have voice if they don't feel comfortable with a teacher, because many students will often say, please don't send me to that teacher. They'll beg me not to send them to that teacher, and it's a teacher that maybe doesn't have a lot of patience and is not so kind. So that shouldn't be happening. I don't think anybody should lose their job, but they might need some kindness and compassionate training. And so I would say that, and I would say that our school systems need to be play-based. It needs to be a way more magical experience. The kids should be part of building castles in schools and also based in activism, looking at what's happening in the world, what are our biggest challenges, and bringing in mentors of people to connect the kids with, scientists or whatever. Because kids, their intelligence is off the charts. Their ability to be creative and just see the world differently than adults is incredible. And so harnessing that power while they're still open like that and getting them to think about what kind of problems can they solve, I think they would solve many things that we struggle with.
Okay. Second part of my bonus question.
Yeah.
I've been in that class environment about 20 years ago, but now you have the luxury to go back.
Yeah.
So thinking back, you being a student and all your friends, the kids now and their friends, how is that environment different now compared to before?
There's more Pokemon, there's more Blaze, there's more video games, there's cell phones. But I would say essentially humanity is humanity. It doesn't change. So kids feel sad, they feel lonely, they feel happy, they feel excited, they feel passionate, they feel hungry, they feel sleepy, they feel sick, they need to be comforted. It's all the same. It's just we have all these different things added. We're not wearing the same clothes, although some of my students are wearing the same clothes. They have slap bracelets and things that I had when I was a kid. But essentially humanity is humanity.
Okay. Last question.
Yeah.
What's the cool profession for kids these days? What do they want to be when they grow up?
I hear a lot of soccer player, you know, things that were
Okay,
common.
that's still popular.
Yeah, so soccer player is a big thing. Sometimes they say teachers. Yeah, most of the time, I'm always interested to ask that question, but I also feel like it's maybe not the best question to ask. But what I do ask my students, besides asking that, is what problem do you see in the world, and how can you help that problem? So I think that's the question to ask.
Yeah, and what do
Yeah.
you get?
Lots of things, because they start talking about, a lot of it is environment. They're very worried about the kids, like they really are concerned about our world. Like if kids ruled the world, we'd have a way better world. We'd have a lot of candy also, but we'd have a way.
I would be okay with that.
Okay, we'd have a way better world because they're like, this is wrong. Like when I tell them things, like just little bits of things, they're like, this is so wrong. This is so wrong what's happening. Why are they hurting people? Why are they hurting the animals? Why aren't people responsible for their garbage? Like all those things they care about. So I think that when we hold that space and make them like more aware of this is what's cool to do. Because sometimes kids will also like, I find this also with people that, not always, but immigrant families that come here, they want the best for their children. They've left a country and or had to run away. They want, like, there's even more pressure on the child. So sometimes those kids are being told and like brainwashed they have to be a doctor, they have to be a lawyer. So I will have a child that's in grade 4 that's absolutely having an anxiety attack because they got a C+ or a B+ on their math paper because they have to be a doctor. And it's really serious. Like they actually think I can't fail anything. So I want adults to be thinking about looking at the child's gifts. I notice, oh, that child is really not great with math, but they're really great with being a friend. Maybe they'd be a good social worker or a therapist. Maybe they'd be a good public speaker. Like noticing what they're really good at and what they're interested in naturally and giving them space to explore and then highlighting it to them. Like this kid wrote a speech the other day, like a 5-minute speech, like, did you ever know you're a really good speaker? And she's like, no. I'm like, you are. I think you could be a speaker if you wanted to. And she's like, I can? And it's just like you can see their little like beings grow, you know? So that is what I'm interested in.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
that's so lovely.
Yeah.
That'll be the end of it. Thank you so much for taking time
thank you.
and being here.